Hi, my name is Evie Hatch. I'm a studio and material specialist at Jackson's Art, and this is a guide to artist pigments and the Pigment Colour Index. Pigments are chemical compounds that give colour to a material by changing how it interacts with light. So visible light is a slice of the electromagnetic spectrum, and really it's a type of electromagnetic radiation. And white light is made up of all of the colours of the visible light spectrum. These colours travel at different wavelengths, and what a pigment does, it absorbs light travelling at certain wavelengths and reflects others. So if you look at this cobalt blue pigment, it's absorbing the red, yellow and orange part of the spectrum and reflecting the blue. Pigments are produced as dry powders, and they can be combined with various binders like linseed oil, gum arabic or acrylic polymer to make artist paint. And at its most basic level, this is what paint is. It's simply pigment and a binder, although some paint may also contain other additives that improve its handling qualities. The practice of using pigment is really ancient. Equipment for grinding pigment has been found in Zambia that dates back around 300,000 years, and that's around the time and the place that modern humans first emerged. So it seems that our desire to harness the power of colour is as old as humanity itself. The very first pigments would have been made by grinding up earth or by charring organic material, and actually these are still sources of pigments today. Like this yellow ochre, its kind of sandy yellowish brown colour is largely due to the presence of hydrated iron oxides, which are found abundantly in the Earth's crust. Carbon-based black pigments as well have been used for thousands of years, like this ivory black, which, as the name suggests, it was once made using ivory, but now it's made using charred bones. These two pigments are essentially what early humans would have used, so in some ways pigments haven't really changed that much. Historically, minerals have also been a really important source of natural inorganic compounds that make really great pigments. So this is malachite. This is a natural copper carbonate mineral. And this was used in ancient Egyptian tomb paintings, as well as in 15th and 16th century Italy by artists like Botticelli, Perugino and Tintoretto. Probably the most famous mineral pigment was made from this. This is a piece of lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone that was the source of natural ultramarine blue pigment. The rock itself was made up of many different minerals, including calcite and pyrite, and you can see that running through the stone here. But the blue is due to the presence of lazurite. Lazurite is a sodium, calcium, aluminium silicate with sulfur, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it produces a really beautiful blue that's been highly prized for centuries. Mineral pigments are quite rare on the artist palette now, and most of them have been replaced with synthetic pigments or even synthetic recreations of the original pigment. And ultramarine blue is a really good example of this. So here is the natural mineral pigment, and this is the synthetic version of it, which was developed in the 19th century, and it's one of the most commonly used pigments used today. They are chemically identical, but you'll notice that the colour is quite different. This is because the pigment particles in the synthetic pigment are smaller in size and more evenly shaped, and it's free from any impurities that might be present in the natural mineral pigment. Pigments can also be made synthetically using metal oxides or metal salts. So for example, cobalt blue is made by roasting oxides of cobalt and aluminium, and the cadmium pigments as well are produced by precipitating a cadmium salt with sodium sulfide. And if you add different proportions of zinc and selenium, you can get a range of colours, from lemon yellow to red. So much of pigment technology is pure chemistry. It's about the chemical transformation of materials. The 20th century has given us a spectrum of pigments derived from petroleum compounds and acids. These include the quinacridone and phthalocyanine families of pigments. So this is a lovely quinacridone violet. It's one of a number of extremely high performance pigments developed in the 20th century. Pigments and dyes are both colorants, but the key difference between them is that dyes are soluble and pigments are insoluble. There are a few pigments that dissolve in certain solvents, but in general, pigments are insoluble solids. When they're combined with a paint binder, they form a suspension. And when you look at paint under a microscope, that's what you see. You see individual pigment particles coated with a binder. It's worth stressing, actually, just how small pigment particles are. So in dry form, they kind of clump together, but individual pigment particles themselves are measured in microns. And to put this into context, human red blood cells measure around 7 microns. This synthetic ultramarine blue has an average pigment particle size of just under 3 microns. And this quinacridone violet is more like 0.1 of a micron. You can make pigments using dyes. This is a process called laking, and it involves precipitating or fixing a soluble dye onto an insoluble substrate to make it suitable for paint making. So this is an example. This is carmine. This is a lake pigment made from a dye produced from crushed cochineal insects. You can get pigments in dry form and make paint by hand, but most artists will encounter pigments in ready-made paint and other artist materials. Pigments are integral to all artist paints, whether that's watercolours, oil, acrylic, gouache, encaustic, as well as dry media like soft pastels, oil pastels, coloured pencils, etc. Gesso contains pigments, usually white pigments like titanium dioxide, which is titanium white, and artist paper is often whitened using titanium dioxide. However, the artist material market is a relatively small part of a massive global pigment industry. Most pigments today are primarily used for things like specialist coatings, as colorants for plastics, for print media, cosmetics, and the car industry. And actually, many modern pigments were initially developed for car paint. Many everyday products contain pigments that are also used in artist paints. For example, phthalo blue is frequently used in toothpaste. And I had a look actually at the ingredients in the makeup I'm wearing, and I found a number of different pigments that are also used in artist paint, including several synthetic red iron oxide pigments in my eyeliner, chromium oxide green in my foundation, and synthetic ultramarine blue in my mascara, which really surprised me. Remember that ultramarine blue used to be made from this, and it used to be the most precious, the most expensive pigment in European painting, more expensive than gold. So it's kind of wild to think about that it's now in my eyelashes. And this is what makes pigments such a rich and fascinating topic. They have such broad histories and applications across many different areas of life, not just in the artist palette. What's really exciting about pigments is that they have multi-dimensional personalities that go beyond colour. And these are really important to consider when you're building your palette. One of these is transparency and opacity, and I'm going to compare this by looking at 2 different green pigments. Phthalo green is a chlorinated copper phthalocyanine pigment developed in the 20th century. It has numerous commercial applications in coating and printing inks, but it also makes a brilliant artist pigment. I'm using professional quality paints here because many economy ranges include opacifiers that can mask the actual qualities of the pigment. So to get closer to the characteristics of pigments, working with professional quality paints that don't use opacifiers is really important. The next is chromium oxide green. This is a synthetic metal oxide pigment that was introduced in the 19th century. It's almost pure anhydrous chromium oxide, and it's commonly used in cosmetics. And if this colour looks familiar, it used to be used to print US dollar bills, which when I heard that, I kind of can't unsee it now, and it just looks like the colour of money. But as you can see, this is a very kind of yellowish, very, very dense colour, a kind of vegetably green, whereas the phthalo green is more of a dark valued, kind of moody forest green. So this is a really good way of looking at opacity and transparency. This is simply an artist's gesso panel, and I've prepared half of it with some black gesso. So first with the phthalo green, we can see here that when the phthalo green is applied in a thin layer, when it's kind of scraped across the surface with the palette knife, it's transparent. And transparent pigments are ideal for glazing techniques, which is when you build up transparent layers that create a sense of depth and often a sense of kind of 3-dimensional realism. Opaque pigments, on the other hand, like the chromium oxide green, are really effective at hiding what's underneath. So you can see the difference here. The French Impressionists, for example, made really good use of opaque pigments to give them kind of bold colour that really comes forward from the canvas. So looking at these 2 greens here, the phthalo green is transparent. It's really brilliant for glazing, has that kind of stained glass effect, whereas the chromium oxide green is dense and extremely opaque. Paint manufacturers can add opacifying agents to their paints to increase the transparency, but generally, hiding power or lack of hiding power is a trait that's inherent to a pigment because of its chemical composition and its structure. It is determined by quite a complex set of factors, including the size and shape of the pigment particles, and to what extent they reflect, scatter, or transmit light. You can, of course, make an opaque paint more transparent by extending it with a medium. But in order to get the best colour payoff so that you're not diluting the colour strength too much, transparent pigments are generally a better choice when transparency is really essential to a technique. It's not that more opaque pigments, like the chromium oxide green, can't be used for glazing. It's just that transparent pigments lend themselves better to it. Transparency and opacity is quite complex when you get quite deep into it. Sometimes the same pigment can vary in covering power depending on what medium it's bound in. And this is to do with the relationship between the refractive indices of the pigment particles and the binder. Tinting strength is another important pigment characteristic. A high tinting pigment is one that is really powerful in mixtures, when not a lot of paint needs to be added to affect a change in colour. And you can really see tinting strength when you mix a colour with white. So this is zinc white. And if I mix kind of equal parts phthalo green and zinc white, you'll be able to see kind of just how powerful phthalo green is actually. It's probably one of the highest tinting pigments available in artist palettes. And mixing a pigment with white is also a really good way of seeing its undertone. So you can see that kind of slightly minty, but very, very bluish green. So I'm going to do the same here with the chromium oxide green, a half and half mixture. And the reason that I'm using zinc white rather than titanium white here is that titanium white is a really good example of a high tinting white. It's very, very dominant, very, very opaque. It can make mixtures a little bit chalky. So when I'm kind of looking at tinting strength, I do tend to use zinc white just because it has more of a medium tinting strength. So again, half and half. Both phthalo and chromium oxide green have pretty powerful tinting strengths. So I'm going to introduce another green pigment here, which is green earth. This is made from natural earth-containing minerals like seladonite and glauconite. And it's a lovely earthy green. Now this is a really, really quiet pigment. It whispers, it doesn't shout. So when I look at this, mixed with the zinc white, I think you'll see what I mean. So again, kind of equal amounts. And it kind of almost entirely disappears. And this is a really useful thing to know. And it's something that you have to be quite sensitive to. So when you're using green earth on your palette, you can't fight with it. You have to use it in a way that it likes being worked with. So when it's in mixtures with dominant pigments, it kind of completely melts away. What I've just demonstrated, many artists already know, and you kind of pick it up intuitively as you're working with paint. You really get to know the tinting strengths of the paints that you have in your palette. And when you're building a palette, it's quite a good idea to have pigments which are of a similar tinting strength, whether that's low or high, so that when they work together in mixtures, they don't overwhelm each other. So being aware of tinting strength is a really good way of getting the most out of your paints. Drying time is another really important property, and this is a characteristic that only really applies to oil painters. If you're working in acrylic or watercolour, then pigments that the paint contains will not really make a real impact on how long the paint takes to dry. But in oil, it's really, really important. So oils don't dry technically, they harden through a process of polymerization that happens when the drying oil reacts with the oxygen in the air. And pigments can affect this process in a number of different ways. Certain pigments are more thirsty than others. They require a high volume of oil to make a workable paint, and often these pigments take a long time to dry. An example of this is alizarin crimson. I have had alizarin crimson on a painting which stayed as wet as the day I painted it for over a week. It's a very, very oily colour. It has a very, very high oil content. And this can be frustrating if you're not anticipating it, and especially if you're on a deadline. Some pigments naturally contain secretive agents which speed up the drying time. Raw umber, for example, contains manganese, which acts as a catalyst for the polymerizing reaction, which takes place inside the drying oil. And cobalt-based pigments also have a secretive effect. Granulation is a really important characteristic for watercolourists. Certain pigments have a tendency to granulate, which is when the pigment particles settle unevenly into the surface of the paper, which creates a kind of mottled textural effect that some artists love and some artists avoid. Granulation usually occurs in pigments that have large, uneven particles, and an example of intense granulation is Potter's Pink, which is one of my favourite watercolour pigments, actually. It feels like it should be an earth pigment, but it's actually a synthetic pigment made by combining tin oxide, alumina, chromium oxide, and quartz at a high temperature. It was invented by an English potter in around 1790, and it has a strong tendency to granulate because of the shape and size of its pigment particles. You can see that mottled effect coming in. It's a very, very gentle pink. And you can encourage granulation by using lots and lots of water and by using rough paper. So you can see how, as it's kind of drying, those irregular pigment particles are settling into the paper there in quite interesting ways. So those are just a few pigment characteristics, and I hope that shows how the properties of pigments go beyond colour. Working with paint is like cooking, and pigments are like the ingredients. They each have different strengths, different flavours, different textures, different personalities, and they come together in really fascinating ways. Lightfastness is the degree to which a pigment is colour fast when exposed to light. Pigments produce colour by selectively absorbing certain wavelengths of visible light. When light is absorbed by a pigment molecule, it raises it to an excited state. And over time, this may lead to the molecular bonds breaking down, which reduces the pigment's ability to absorb and reflect light. And that's why the colour appears to fade. Pigments that have a good resistance to breaking down are known as lightfast, while those that break down quickly are called fugitive. And fugitive is a great word for it. It's like how the colour is running away from us. This is a lightfastness test that I've been running. These watercolour swatches have been in a south-facing window of the studio for about 3 months now. The right-hand swatch is the full strength colour, and then I've diluted the colour 50-50 with water and then 50-50 with zinc white. And half of the swatch has been covered up so I can compare the exposed and unexposed paint. So this is the quinacridone violet. This hasn't changed at all, but if you look at this natural carmine lake, this is a lake pigment made from a dye, it's completely changed. Those molecular bonds have completely broken down. And this is irreversible. This faded colour won't come back now. We don't use genuine carmine very much anymore, and you can see why. But sometimes you can see a kind of faded rose colour in Renaissance and medieval paintings. And if you see that, it's possible that that was once bright red. The third colour I tested here is Opera Rose, which is a mixture of a lightfast quinacridone pigment and a fugitive fluorescent dye. It's really popular in watercolour ranges. And you can see how it's just started to get a little bit duller in that last mixture there with white. This test is ongoing though, and I'll keep it in the window for another 3 months and see how they get on. I don't expect the quinacridone violet to change at all. The quinacridone family are generally really excellent in terms of lightfastness. Permanence is different to lightfastness. Impermanent pigments can react negatively to things like humidity, environmental pollutants, other pigments, or particular binders. And this can cause the colour to fade or change over time, or the paint might form a brittle film that's prone to delamination. An example of an impermanent pigment is smalt. This is a cobalt-containing potassium glass, used in Europe since at least the 16th century, but cobalt has been used to colour glass for thousands and thousands of years. Smalt can deteriorate in an oil binder as the potassium leaches out of the pigment particles, making the blue turn into a sludgy grey-brown colour. And we can see that in numerous different historical paintings, including those by Veronese and Rembrandt. Many impermanent pigments like smalt have largely been resigned to history now, and they aren't really commonly used anymore because of the longevity issues they present. Modern pigments are very much developed with permanence in mind. Chemistry has come a very long way, and we can much more accurately predict how a material is going to behave chemically. But art conservation is ongoing, and we can never be 100% sure what the pigments in a work of art might look like in 100 years' time. If you look at the label on a tube of artist quality watercolour, oil, acrylic or gouache, it may include a short code, or more than one code, beginning with letters and ending with a number. For example, PB29, PG7, PY43 and PBR7. Sometimes these are on the back of the label, and sometimes they're on the front. And sometimes they're in quite tiny writing, and other times they're displayed much more prominently. These are standardised pigment names assigned by the International Colour Index. The International Colour Index is a database published jointly by the Society of Dyers and Colourists in the UK and the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colourists. It was first published in 1924, and it categorises thousands of different pigments and dyes that are used across a variety of different applications, including artist paints. The Colour Index classifies pigments according to their essential chemical composition, and each pigment entry has two identifying codes: a Colour Index constitution number and a Colour Index generic name. The generic name is the easiest to remember, and that's often what's used on artist paint labels. It includes the general colour family of the pigment, such as blue, green, yellow or brown, and an identifying number. For example, PB15 is short for pigment blue 15, and it indicates that it's a copper phthalocyanine pigment, a deep blue synthetic pigment developed in the 1930s, often known as phthalo blue. The constitution number for copper phthalocyanine is CI74160, but you'll rarely come across that in artist information. PB15 is the code to look for. Some other examples: PG18, pigment green 18, indicates the pigment is hydrated chromium sesquioxide, commonly known as viridium. PW4, pigment white 4, is zinc oxide, and you might know that as zinc white. PY43, pigment yellow 43, is a natural hydrated iron oxide, in other words, a natural yellow ochre. You don't need to learn these codes by heart. There are lots of resources available so you can look up what the codes refer to. On the Jackson's blog, actually, there's an index that lists the entries for each colour group. It's worth bearing in mind that the producers of commercial paints are not legally required to list the pigments on the tube. They do it because they understand that artists like to know and have come to expect that information will be provided. Interestingly, it isn't the case for coloured pencils or pastels. It would be great if pigments were always listed on these materials too, but at the moment that isn't common practice. The colour names that you find on tubes can be really evocative. Names like sap green, yellow ochre, gold ochre. All of these names kind of evoke the kind of colour you can expect to find in the tube. However, paint names don't always tell you what the paint contains, and the Pigment Colour Index can tell you much more about what you can expect in terms of tinting strength, texture, covering power, and the overall character of the paint. A really good example of this is paints that are labelled as lemon yellow. Lemon yellow can be made from a variety of different pigments, and these are just three of them. Pigment yellow 3, which is an arylide pigment, Pigment Yellow 175, benzimidazole pigment, and Pigment Yellow 53, which is an inorganic nickel titanate pigment. These pigments are from very different families. They have very different characteristics. For example, the nickel titanate yellow is more milky and opaque. It also has a tendency to granulate, which is important for watercolourists because not very many yellow pigments granulate in watercolour. And it has a lower tinting strength than the arylide and benzimidazole pigments. The benzimidazole yellow has better light fastness than the arylide yellow, but the arylide yellow is the brightest of all three and the coolest, the most lemony. So the Pigment Colour Index gives you an advanced insight into the nature of the colour before you've even opened the tube. If you can see that one of these pigments is in a paint that you're thinking of using, then you can choose one or the other depending on what you need for your painting. This is where the Pigment Index is really useful. So say if you've got a couple of different lemon yellows in your collection, you can look at the Pigment Index and have a pretty good idea of what the characteristics are going to be before you've even opened the tube. That's an example of paints with the same name but made with different pigments. And another way in which the pigment index can be really helpful is when you have one pigment that's sold under different names. Paint makers can essentially call their colours whatever they want. So looking at paints containing only copper phthalocyanine, pigment blue 15, it has been known by multiple different names, including phthalocyanine blue, phthalo blue, monestial blue, monastral blue, helio blue, Windsor blue, primary cyan, Scheveningen blue. And because these colours contain the same pigment, they are going to be extremely similar. Not exactly the same, because every paint maker makes their paint differently. But as an example, here is 3 examples of phthalocyanine blue, the same pigment across different brands. And you can see that they share the same kind of classic characteristics of a copper phthalocyanine blue. A high tinting strength, semi-transparency, and very, very dark when they're used straight out of the tube. When you start looking beyond paint names and look at the actual pigments, it can be a really economic way of making colour choices, because you can check to see if you're actually buying a different pigment or if you're buying a pigment that you already have under another name. It's really frustrating to get a new paint tube to the studio only to open it and find that it's the same or extremely similar to a paint you already have. The pigment index can also tell you if you're using a genuine pigment or not. And when we talk about genuine pigments, we're talking about an authentic expression of a certain colour. So for example, Prussian blue, genuine Prussian blue, is made with pigment blue 27. A genuine Naples yellow is made with a pigment yellow 41. Pigments that we describe as genuine often have a grounding in art history, and it kind of reassures the artist that they're working with the real thing, with characteristics that are authentic to that particular colour. A hue, on the other hand, is a paint that contains a mixture of pigments that recreate the genuine colour. And this can be done for a variety of reasons. Certain pigments are extremely expensive, so a hue makes that particular shade accessible. Some pigments are simply not used anymore because they have poor lightfastness or they're toxic. Naples yellow is an example. The genuine pigment is a compound of lead and antimony, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a genuine Naples yellow in any range today, although they do exist, and this is one of them. Naples yellow is the earliest known synthetically produced yellow pigment. It was probably first produced around 1500 BC, and for centuries it was used as a colorant for glass and ceramics in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. It wasn't used by European painters until around the mid-17th century, and the name actually came from a popular misunderstanding that it was made from volcanic rock around the city of Naples, and the name has really stuck. So this is the genuine pigment. It's very, very kind of buttery colour. It can also vary in hue. It can also be more of a lemony colour as well. When you see the colour in paint ranges today, they are usually hues. They're usually made up of different yellow, brown and white pigments, and it varies in colour between every range. So here is a selection of Naples yellow hues across different watercolour ranges, and you can see how different each one of them is. And I've also written down here the pigment index numbers, which shows what different mixtures these have been made out of. Another reason why a hue might be used is that some pigments are not compatible with certain binders. Prussian blue is a good example of this. Most, if not all, Prussian blue acrylic paints are hues, and they contain a mixture of blue and black pigments rather than the genuine pigment. This is because genuine Prussian blue is quite unstable in alkaline binders. It's entirely a matter of taste whether you use genuine pigments or hues. For some artists, it really matters because they're looking for the characteristics of a particular colour, but other artists might find that the hue works better for them. Many paint makers state on the label whether or not a colour is a hue, but some don't, and it can be misleading. So it's worth checking the pigment index just to confirm that it is the colour you're expecting it to be. Hues are great for a number of reasons, but it's worth bearing in mind that a genuine pigment is never going to be 100% absolutely accurately recreated using different pigments. It can be really easy to romanticize genuine historical pigments over hues, but it's not true that historical pigments are inherently better or that they make better paintings. In fact, many genuine pigments throughout history have been extremely toxic, have had poor lightfastness or permanence, or have been prohibitively expensive. In many ways, hues have made colour safer, more permanent, and more accessible to many artists. A single pigment paint contains just one pigment, and a mixed pigment paint contains more than one pigment. And it's quite an important thing to be aware of. Some artists prefer to only use single pigment colours because of how they behave in mixtures. The more different pigments are in a mixture, the less clarity it's going to have. You know, if you mix up all of your paints on your palette, it kind of comes to a brown or a grey. It's the same thing. The more likely it is to be a bit murky, which is a quality that artists often call muddiness. There's nothing wrong with so-called muddy mixtures. They can be very complex and enigmatic, but it's just about making sure that you're making an informed choice so that your colour mixing is really intentional. And with the Pigment Colour Index, you can see by just a glance at a tube how many pigments are in the paint. The colour index was not compiled with artists in mind, and as you get to know it, you'll really begin to realise that. As I said before, the colour index categorises colour according to its essential chemical composition, but some of those categories are broader than others. Some are very specific and it will tell you a lot. For example, pigment green 17, chromium oxide green, is always a yellowish dense opaque green with a medium drying time in oil and should granulate in watercolour. You can see that listed on a label, and regardless of what the name of the colour is, you can be pretty sure what to expect in terms of characteristics. And here are 4 different pigment green 17 watercolours across different ranges, and you can see how similar these are. It's the same for synthetic ultramarine blue, pigment blue 29. By and large, the colour characteristics are going to be pretty similar. Other Pigment Colour Index entries are much more broad, and a classic example which you will come across is PBR7, pigment brown 7. It refers to a natural brown iron oxide pigment, also containing a small amount of manganese oxide. But the categorisation covers a vast array of different colours, from yellowish raw sienna to greenish raw umber. And this is because the chemical composition of these pigments is essentially the same, but different proportions of certain minerals change the colour completely. PBR7 also covers the burnt varieties of the pigment, like burnt sienna and burnt umber, and these are made by calcining or roasting the raw pigment, which partially dehydrates the hydrated iron oxides and makes the colour redder and deeper. So when you see PBR7 on a paint label, all it really tells you is that it's a natural brown iron oxide. PBR7 pigments vary a lot in hue, transparency and tinting strength, and you need to rely on the colour swatch or the colour description to get the best idea of what to expect from it. As you get to know the Pigment Colour Index, you get to know which entries are quite specific and which ones are more broad. You can find Pigment Colour Index numbers listed for artist paints on the Jackson's website, where that information is available. On our blog, you'll also find an index for all of the Pigment Index entries, so you can find out more about each pigment's history and its characteristics. I hope you can see how being familiar with the Pigment Index can help you become a really discerning connoisseur of artist colour. It's also great to just get a bit nerdy about colour, and there's always more to learn about the chemistry of artist paint. Artists have so many choices today. Some paint ranges contain hundreds of colours, so the Pigment Index can be a really useful way to cut through marketing, to look beyond the name of a colour, and get to the essential characteristics of the pigment. Pigments are such exciting materials. They have fascinating origin stories, they've played really consequential roles in art history, and each one behaves in unique and characterful ways. Getting to know them can help you get the most from your paints and can enrich and empower your painting practice.